The guard at the service entrance barely looked at her face when he checked her papers. He ran his finger down the list of names on his clipboard, made a small mark with his pen, and waved her through with the flat disinterest of a man who had performed this same task 500 times and found it no more remarkable the 500th time than the first. Mara walked past him with her bag held in both hands and her chin angled slightly down, and in the 12 steps between the iron gate and the service door, she had already counted 4 security positions, noted 2 structural vulnerabilities along the outer wall, and registered that the nearest mounted camera was oriented toward the main approach road and not toward the service entrance at all. She did not think of any of this as remarkable. It was simply what her eyes did when they entered a new space. Over 11 years of rigorous training and 4 years of active fieldwork, observation had long since stopped being something she chose to do, and had become something closer to breathing, continuous, automatic, and essential in the way that essential things become invisible over time. Cresthaven Estate sat at the far edge of a wide valley, old dense forest pressing close on the northern boundary, and a long stone wall enclosing the other 3 sides. From the approach road it was built to impress, and it succeeded without apparent effort. Tall corner towers, iron gates set between thick posts, gravel paths lined with hedges that had been trimmed so precisely and for so long that they had taken on the appearance of architecture rather than plant life. The main building rose behind all of it in dark gray stone that caught the early autumn light and held it with a flatness that suggested the building was not particularly interested in being admired, only in being substantial. Up close, once you passed the gate and moved toward the service side, the grandeur resolved into something more functional. A working household of 47 permanent staff members, 3 kitchens, 2 formal dining rooms, a set of reception areas on the 2nd floor used for the PAC's official business, and a private residential wing on the 3rd and 4th floors for the Alpha King and his senior command structure. The service corridor ran under all of it, below the formal level, narrow and plain, and lit by mounted lamps, spaced at regular intervals, smelling of stone and soap and the warmth of the kitchen fires that had been running for 2 hours already. 3 weeks before this morning, Mara had sat across from Owen Hale, in a room with no windows, in a building with no sign above its door, on a street in the Eastern Territories that served primarily as an access road for a warehouse district, and that no one would choose to walk down unless they already knew what was there. Owen ran field operations for the Eastern Combat Authority, and had been doing it long enough that he had stripped his communication style down to its most essential form, which meant he wasted nothing, not words, not silence, not eye contact. He had the particular quality of a person who had thought through every option in a given situation before walking into the room to discuss any of them, who arrived at meetings already knowing which option he was there to recommend, and who was simply confirming whether the person across from him was ready to receive it. There had been a map, a photograph, and a thin folder on the table between them. He spread the floor plans of the estate across the table and went through them with her, without hurrying, because Owen Hale was one of the people in his field who understood that the time invested in the information stage was returned with significant interest during execution, and that rushing the first part was the single most common way to compromise the second. He pointed out the service level, the restricted zones, the residential wing, the specific corridors connecting the public areas of the building to the private ones, the secondary stairwells that did not appear on the formal architectural record, but were documented in the authority's intelligence files from a previous operation in the same region. When he had finished going through the plans, he put them aside and folded his hands on the table in front of him. 6 weeks to the summit, he said. 3 independent intelligence channels pointing to the same conclusion. Someone inside or directly connected to Cresthaven Estate has placed a contract against the life of the Alpha King. Time to execute during the summit, when the building will be at its most crowded and its perimeter most difficult to fully control. We need the source identified and neutralized before the summit begins. She picked up the photograph and studied it. It showed the interior of the estate's main dining hall, long and formal and populated with people. She had looked at the edges of the image, where the servants moved along the walls with their practiced efficiency, and understood without him saying anything that this was where she would be positioned. "How many people in the building will know I am there?" she asked. "Me," Owen said. "And you?" She had nodded once. She spent the remaining time memorizing the floor plans, running through each level until she could reproduce it from memory, with the accuracy she would have if she were standing inside the building looking at the actual walls. This was a skill that had taken her 3 years of deliberate practice to develop to the level she now maintained it, and Ren Valos had told her early on that it would repay the investment many times across a career. He had been right about this, as he had been right about most things, though she had not always recognized it at the moment he said it. She handed the floor plans back to Owen at the end of the session. He did not say good luck. He said, "Do it right," which was what he always said, and which she had always understood to mean the same thing. Clara Fenn, the head housekeeper of Cresthaven Estate, met her in the service courtyard with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had spent 30 years managing large households and had refined the intake of new employees to a process that ran on a reliable internal clock. She was compact and gray-haired, with sharp brown eyes that had assessed thousands of new staff members across her career, and that could form an accurate preliminary picture in the first 30 seconds of contact. She looked at Mara briefly, checked the name on the intake form, reviewed the recommendation letter from the Southern Territory household without reading past the opening paragraph, because she was evaluating the structure of the thing rather than its content, and handed over a gray uniform, with the air of someone whose attention had already moved to the next item on the day's agenda. The house rules came out in a practiced, unbroken stream, every rule delivered at the same weight and the same pace, because Clara Fenn believed that the rules did not require special emphasis to communicate their importance. If you were paying attention, you understood them. If you were not paying attention, emphasis would not help you. Service corridors only unless directed otherwise by a senior staff member. No personal conversations during working hours beyond what the task required. No access to the upper residential wing without explicit assignment. Any concerns or observations to Clara and to no one else in the building. Meals in the lower staff room at the fixed times posted on the notice board. Personal items kept to the assigned room and out of working areas. "Is that clear?" Clara said at the end, looking at Mara in the brief, final way she looked at everything she was assessing. "Yes," Mara said. Clara made a mark on her clipboard and moved to the next task, which was where she moved after every stage of every process, because standing still was not something Clara Fenn did during working hours. Her room was at the far end of the basement corridor, small and functional, with 2 narrow beds, a single wardrobe divided equally, 1 high window that looked out at ground level onto the gravel of the service path, and a bedside lamp that produced warm orange light, slightly easier on the eyes than the fluorescent lighting in the corridor outside. She shared the room with a young woman named Nora, who was 21, and had been at the estate for 8 months, and who came from a village 2 territories south, and who had the warm, slightly tired energy of someone who was genuinely good at her work, in a place that did not always acknowledge that, and who had developed in response a quality of internal warmth that was real and freely offered. Nora welcomed her on the first evening with the practical hospitality of someone who remembered what it felt like to arrive somewhere new without a guide. She showed Mara the extra blanket shelf in the corridor cabinet, explained that the second lamp from the left in the hallway needed 2 switches before it held its light, walked her through the meal schedule and the fastest routes between the frequently used areas of the lower floor, and talked openly about the staff structure, which supervisors were approachable and which were not, where the schedule had flexibility built in and where it did not, which of the upper floor footmen was reliable when you needed something clarified. Mara received all of it with genuine attention. She asked small, natural questions at appropriate moments, the kind that confirmed she was listening without appearing to be compiling information, and she filed everything Nora said into the part of her memory that was building a picture of this place, not with the structure of a map or a list, but with the texture of a lived environment, the way it moved and breathed, and produced meaning through its people. The first week was about foundations. She cleaned the lower floor corridors in the early mornings before the building fully woke, which meant she moved through the service level when the spaces were empty, and she could observe them at their simplest. She polished silverware on Tuesday afternoons in the basement room at the end of the East Passage, which was quiet, repetitive work that left her mind free to review the week's observations from a position that required no visible attention. She served at the midday meal on rostered days, which placed her in the main ground floor dining room for close to 2 hours, with a legitimate reason to be present, and the full layout of the room and its regular occupants in her continuous view. She mapped the variations between the floor plan she had memorized and the actual building across the first 3 days. Most differences were minor and explicable. Rooms that had been subdivided since the original plans were drawn. A doorway rehung to open in the opposite direction. A service stairwell at the northwest end that was clearly a later addition. None of these were alarming. But one detail registered on her second day and stayed registered. At the far end of the east basement passage, behind a door heavier than any of the others on that level, and fitted with a lock that was visibly newer than the door itself, was a room whose corridor sign described it as disused utility storage. The combination of the newer lock, the heavier door, and the deliberate ordinariness of the description told her three things simultaneously. The room was in active use. Its use was not what the sign indicated, and someone had decided at a specific recent point that the existing security on this room needed to be upgraded. She did not test the lock on the first day. She noted it and moved on, because the first week was about building invisibility, and invisibility was the foundation on which everything else rested. She met Dorian Voss on her third day. She was coming from the Tuesday polishing session carrying the completed tray of silverware back toward the dining room storage, when he appeared from the intersection ahead, moving with the unhurried authority of a man who had been the most significant person in most rooms he had ever entered, and who had arranged his sense of himself around that fact so completely that it had long since stopped being a performance and had become simply the way he moved through the world. He was tall, broad-shouldered, built in the way that came from sustained disciplined training, maintained across many years of professional life, and he wore the dark formal jacket of Senior Pack Command, with 2 service medals on the chest that she recognized from the briefing materials, both earned during actual field campaigns, both significant. He stopped her with the generic address of a job title, not her name, because he had not needed to learn it. He said that the silverware should have been back in storage earlier, and that the schedule was not a suggestion. She knew this was not accurate. She had reviewed every posted rule in the lower floor staff areas twice, and no such rule existed about silverware return timing. But she said she was sorry, and would be more careful. And she said it with the measured calm of someone who had decided this exchange was not the right context for anything more than the minimum required response. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a person checking whether the individual in front of them is going to be interesting or difficult. She gave him nothing that answered either question. He moved on. She stood in the corridor after he left, and noticed that her breathing had not shifted at all during the exchange. This was not a performance. It was the result of something Ren Valos had worked on with her, from early in her training. The specific discipline of keeping the body's interior environment stable when the external environment applied pressure. Not suppression, which stored the reaction for later, and was therefore a deferred problem rather than a solved one. Not detachment, which removed you from the room in a way that was its own category of risk. Something closer to genuine stability. A deep, cultivated groundedness that did not move when things pushed against it. Ren Valos had told her once, when she was 15, and had made a mistake that cost her an afternoon's work, and felt the frustration pulling at her focus, that people who would try to use power over her would almost always reveal exactly who they were in the first 30 seconds of contact. Not because they were careless, but because the exercise of power in those situations required establishing an audience first, and the first 30 seconds was always when the audience was being established. Her job was not to respond in those 30 seconds. Her job was to listen to what was being revealed about the person doing it. She had listened carefully when Dorian Voss walked away. She had learned several things from 30 seconds of listening. On her 4th day, she observed Felix Drum with sustained proximity for the first time. She had registered him on day 2, passing through the ground floor corridor at a time when his schedule would not have placed him there, and had noted him without lingering because lingering was the specific quality of attention that created memory in others. Now, assigned to the ground floor corridor polishing detail for the afternoon, she had a legitimate and continuous reason to be in his environment. Felix Drum was thin, approximately 30 years old, with pale blue eyes and clean hands, and a particular way of occupying a space that was designed, through conscious practice or accumulated professional habit, to take up as little of it as possible. He moved through the corridors with the low-profile quality of someone who had learned that visibility was a liability in the environments he typically worked in. She recognized this because she practiced it herself, and recognizing it in another person carried a specific kind of significance. People learned to minimize their presence for one of 2 reasons. They had been in situations where standing out was genuinely dangerous, or they had been trained to understand that invisibility was a professional tool. Both categories were relevant to her assignment. She also noticed the sustained tension in the small muscles around his jaw. Not the sharp tension of acute stress, but the background tension of someone managing a continuous level of alertness that did not reach the surface but never fully relaxed either. She had worn that tension herself during long placements, and she knew what it felt like from the inside. That evening, carrying a tray of empty glasses back through the ground floor corridor toward the kitchen, she caught 4 words through a door that stood 2 inches open. Felix Drum's voice and a second voice she placed as Grant, the supervisor of the second kitchen section, a heavy-set man of about 40, whom she had observed 3 times at various points during the lower floor schedule, and who had a specific habit of standing slightly apart from whatever group he was near. The 4 words came quickly and quietly, before the door shifted, and the rest became inaudible. Before the summit ends. She carried the tray to the kitchen, set it down, and continued to the next item on her task list. In the part of her awareness that never fully stopped working, she turned those words against everything she had gathered in 4 days. The locked room, the corridor checks, the mud on Felix Drum's heel that matched the clay composition of territory, 40 miles east, where 3 of the pack's known opponents maintained active infrastructure. Grant's laugh after those words, the releasing tension quality of a laugh that was not about humor. She went to sleep that night, the way she always slept at the beginning of an assignment, finding its shape, without excess, without delay, with the clear interior quiet of someone who has identified the work clearly enough to rest before continuing it. The valley outside was cold with early autumn. She had 43 days until the summit. She was in the right place. The rest was patience and time, and she had both. The morning of the 5th day started at 4:43. She was sitting up before her internal timing reached the mark she had set, which was something that happened on assignments when the body understood a new phase had begun and started to run slightly ahead of the schedule. She dressed in the dark without the lamp, because Nora was sleeping and she had memorized the layout of her side of the room in sufficient detail to move through it without light. The basement corridor was empty at this hour, the lamps on low running power, the stone floor cool through the soles of her shoes. She had 11 minutes before the first kitchen crew arrived and began populating the lower floor with the noise and movement that would make certain kinds of movement through the building more complicated. 11 minutes was more than she needed. She moved through the service corridor toward the east passage at the pace of someone on a legitimate early task, because pace was its own explanation in a building where explanations sometimes needed to be available without time to construct them. The east passage was quiet, the lamp at its entrance casting a low yellow light that pushed only partway down the length of it, before the far end remained in deeper shadow. She walked to the heavy door and stood in front of it for a moment, with her attention fully outward, listening to the building and to the space behind the door. The room was empty. She was certain of this before she touched the lock, certain in the specific way that came from years of learning to read the quality of stillness and the particular absence of sound that a space produces when no one is inside breathing. She retrieved the pick from the pocket in her cuff, where it had been every day since arrival, worked through the 5-pin tumbler in 34 seconds, and stepped inside. The room was approximately 4 meters by 3. 2 old metal shelving units still lined one wall, their bases leaving rust marks on the stone floor that spoke to how long they had been in place. But most of the room's current configuration was new, and it had clearly been in its current configuration for a meaningful period. Against the far wall, on a low table placed there specifically for the purpose, was a compact communications unit of a type she recognized from the second year of her fieldwork. It was designed for secure transmission over medium to long distances, portable enough to be moved in 2 cases, powerful enough to reach anywhere in the relevant territory with the right protocol. It was not running, but it was clean. No dust on the housing, no stiffness in the adjustment controls when she tested them with a careful touch, no oxidation on the connection points. It was being maintained and used on a regular schedule by someone who knew what they were doing. Beside the communications unit was a cloth-bound ledger. She did not touch it. She leaned forward at the angle that allowed her to read the visible pages without disturbing the ledger's position, and committed what she saw to memory in the method she had been trained to use, not reading for immediate comprehension, but reading for accurate reconstruction later, the way a camera captures, rather than the way a reader processes. What was on the pages was a coded shorthand, not a standard cipher, but a personalized notation system, the kind developed by people who did not trust standard systems, or who were competent enough to build their own. She filed the visual completely and moved on. 2 sections of the old shelving unit had been repurposed. Where utility equipment had once been stacked, there were now storage boxes, labeled with designations that clearly did not match their contents. She pressed her fingertips lightly to the nearest box, and felt the density of contained equipment, rather than the lightness of empty or near-empty containers. She noted the dimensions and weight distribution, and did not open them. She spent 6 minutes in the room. She left it exactly as she had found it, relocked the door, and walked back down the east passage at the same pace she had entered. By the time the first kitchen crew arrived at 5:11, she was in the west corridor, already working the floor detail, moving the brush in the pattern the schedule specified, with the specific quality of automatic physical competence that freed the rest of her attention entirely. The incident happened at 11:17 in the east corridor of the ground floor. She had been assigned the silverware transport, a task she had performed twice before without incident. She was on the east route, which was quieter than the main corridor, and better suited to carrying something fragile without navigating foot traffic. The tray was fully loaded and balanced correctly, her grip stable in the practiced way that came from carrying trays for 3 weeks, and from balance recovery training that had begun when she was 14, and had never fully stopped. She heard him coming from the cross corridor ahead. She had learned his footsteps in the particular involuntary way you learn the sounds of a space you inhabit regularly. His footfalls had a distinctive weight and a particular pace, the pace of a man who moved through spaces as though they belonged to him, which in the practical sense they mostly did. She registered the sound and adjusted nothing about her own movement, because there was no reason to adjust anything. Dorian Voss came around the corner and stopped in the center of the corridor. The specific quality of that stop told her something before he had said a word, because a person who stops in the center of a corridor where someone else is approaching has already made a decision about the interaction before the other party has had any input into it. There were 12 people in range at that moment. She had the count without thinking about it. A senior footman at the far end near the east stairwell, 3 members of the morning cleaning crew who had turned from the side passage and were now stationary, 2 kitchen workers who had slowed at the adjacent intersection, others at varying distances, all of them positioned to observe. He said that the morning shift had been running behind schedule, and that this was becoming a pattern. He said it in the direction of the corridor rather than directly at her, in the way people address situations rather than individuals when they want their words to land in the shared space between them rather than be something that can be individually replied to. He said that Clara's standards appeared to have slipped. Then he reached out and struck the edge of the tray. The force was calibrated. She noted that immediately. Not random or excessive, but precise. Enough to tip the balance without fully overturning it. The kind of force that could, in a different retelling, be described as accidental. A brush of the arm in a narrow corridor. But it was not accidental. The angle was too specific, the timing too deliberate, the result too exactly within the range that produced maximum visible disruption, without the appearance of direct aggression. 4 pieces of silverware left the tray and hit the marble floor with the sharp, carrying sound of metal on stone. In a quiet corridor in mid-morning, it was a loud and clear sound, the kind that makes everyone in range turn and look. Everyone in range turned and looked. He stood over the moment he had created and addressed it as a circumstance he had been handed, rather than one he had made. He told the corridor at large that this was the standard of lower floor work he had been observing, that he expected Clara Fenn to be informed, that the standard needed correction. He said it in his carrying voice, the one shaped by years of commanding large groups of people in environments that required projection, and then he looked at Mara and told her to pick it up. She set the tray carefully on the floor. She knelt. She picked up each piece of silverware, one at a time, with hands that were steady in the genuine way, rather than the performed way, because she had separated the surface of this situation from what was actually happening underneath it. The surface was a man with medals standing over her in a public corridor, and 12 people watching. What was underneath was a significant piece of information about the way Dorian Voss understood and exercised power, publicly, specifically, calibrated to an audience, with a precision that suggested long practice. These were things worth knowing about a person in his position, in a building where she had important work to do. She reloaded the tray and stood and said, without looking up at him, that she was sorry for the disruption. He made a brief dismissive sound and walked away. The corridor reassembled its ambient sounds, distant kitchen noise, footsteps resuming their routes, the ordinary background of a large household continuing. The senior footman found something requiring attention on the wall to his left. The kitchen workers continued through the intersection. The cleaning crew exchanged a brief look and moved on. Clara found her in the kitchen 40 minutes later. She spoke quietly, away from the other staff, and asked if Mara was all right with the particular compression in her voice that told Mara, Clara already knew exactly what had happened, because in a building of this size, nothing of that visibility remained unknown for long. "I am fine," Mara said. "Thank you," Clara said, quietly, and with a control that had something genuinely angry moving behind it, held in by professional discipline. "That should not have happened." "I know," Mara said. Clara put her hand briefly on Mara's forearm, then withdrew it, and moved to the next task, and Mara understood that the gesture was the most Clara could offer in a working morning, and that it was offered with complete sincerity. That evening, positioned near the East Wing service stairwell on the second floor during the window cleaning assignment, she watched the ground floor corridor below. At 7:19, Felix Drum emerged from the East Passage direction, and moved through the ground floor, with a pace slightly increased from his interior building pace. The specific increase she had now logged as associated with his movement toward an exit, rather than within the building. He was carrying something held close against his ribcage, between his arm and his jacket, flat, thin, the shape and size of a document or envelope. He turned before the main lobby, and went down the secondary stairwell toward the lower service exit. She could not follow him without creating a gap in her assignment log that would require explanation. She noted the time, the direction, the held item, and the pace change, and returned to the window cleaning with the steady hands of someone who had been doing exactly this the whole time. She was building something, piece by piece, the locked room and its contents. Felix Drum, and his corridor checks, and his early evening exits with documents held close. Grant and his 10 o'clock departures, and the dead drop location she had not yet confirmed. The pattern was not yet complete, but it was assembling, and she could see the direction it was moving. That night, she wrote her first encrypted operational report, in the shorthand she had used since her second year in the field. She wrote it by the small bedside lamp, with Nora sleeping quietly in the other bed, covering the pages with her left arm while her right hand worked. And when it was done, she folded it to its operational dimension and tucked it into the lining of her bag. Contact point: the bakery, 3 streets west, Saturday morning between 6 and 7. 2 days. She reviewed the day completely, assessed what she had confirmed and what she still needed, then put it away and let the day go, because carrying the working day into the night degraded the quality of rest, and she needed rest. In the east basement passage, the locked room held what it held. Above her, Felix Drum was in his room, with whatever he had been carrying when he walked toward the service exit. The work was waiting, and she was patient, and in the morning she would continue. She slept. The building settled into its night quiet. The valley outside was dark and cold with early autumn, and she had 41 days until the summit, and she intended to use every one of them correctly. It was a servant named Iris who went to the Alpha King first. She had been at Cresthaven for 6 years and had worked the ground floor corridor detail for the last 3 of those years, which meant she had seen many things that she had chosen, over the course of that time, to keep to herself, because knowing the difference between what to report and what to absorb was one of the most important skills a person in her position could develop. She had learned to read the atmosphere of the building, the way sailors learn to read weather, early, accurately, and with an understanding that the signs that appeared small were often the signs that mattered most. She had been in the east corridor when Dorian knocked the tray from Mara's hands. She had been close enough to feel the displaced air of the falling silverware, and to watch the 12 people in range do the individual thing each of them did, with what they had witnessed, which was mostly to look away and continue on. She had looked away and continued on too, in the moment, because that was what the situation allowed. But she had not put it away. She had carried it for 2 days, turning it over and testing it against what she knew about the estate, and its working, and the people in it. And at the end of those 2 days, she had decided that she was going to do something about it. She had not spoken to the Alpha King directly before. She had never needed to, and had never expected to. But there was a formal mechanism for lower floor staff to submit a written request for audience with the King's personal secretary, a mechanism that existed precisely for situations that the normal chain of reporting could not adequately handle. and she used it. The request she submitted was brief and careful. She had witnessed an incident involving the beta and a lower-floor servant that she believed the king should be informed of. She gave the date, the corridor, and nothing else, and she filed it through the formal channel and waited. The appointment came back for Thursday morning, which was 4 days after the incident. She went upstairs at the designated time, into the part of the building she had cleaned many times but had never otherwise entered, and she sat in the chair the king's personal secretary placed for her outside the study door and waited again. And when she was called in, she stood in a room with high windows and books, organized by subject, and a large desk, behind which the Alpha King sat, in the way that people who are accustomed to receiving difficult information sit, which is with a particular quality of ready attention that does not lean forward or lean back, but holds its position. She told him what she had seen. She told it simply and chronologically, without editorializing, in the way she had decided to tell it during the 4 days of waiting. Just the corridor, the time, the people present, what happened, and what she observed in the aftermath. The king listened without interrupting. He asked 2 clarifying questions at the end, both of which confirmed he had followed the account precisely. He thanked her, which was something she had not expected, and told her that he would look into it. She left the study feeling that she had done the right thing. She walked back down through the building to the lower floors and resumed her work and said nothing about the appointment to anyone, not because she was ashamed of it, but because she had decided it was not something that needed to be discussed, and that was the kind of decision she was good at making and keeping. The Alpha King sat with the information for the remainder of the morning. Caius Drev was not a man who had become Alpha King by accident or by inheritance alone. He had earned his position through a combination of genuine capability, political intelligence, and the kind of personal authority that is different from physical power, and in some ways harder to resist, because it was grounded in demonstrated competence rather than in rank. His study was large and ordered in the way that working studies of disciplined people are ordered. Everything in a specific place for a specific reason. Nothing decorative that was not also functional. He sat at his desk in this room, and he thought about what Iris had told him, and he felt the specific weight of the matter settling into the part of his awareness that was responsible for tracking unresolved things. He had a border negotiation briefing at 11, a territorial finance review at 2, a meeting with the Northern Pact's advance delegation at 4 to discuss the summit agenda. He had 17 other items logged for the day. The matter of the corridor incident occupied a layer of his attention that was real, but that could not, in the competing pressure of the day's larger concerns, quite push its way to the top. He told himself he would address it with Dorian when the right moment came. He meant it. He went into the border briefing, and the negotiation details displaced everything else for 60 minutes. And when he came out, the finance review was already arranged and ready. And by the time the day's scheduled work was done, the matter had not been addressed, but it was still there, still waiting, still pressing at the edge of his thinking, with the low patience of an unresolved thing. He told himself he would address it tomorrow, when the right moment came. The right moment did not come in the first week after the incident. There were, as there always were, more pressing things, and the pressing things had a way of filling the space that the important, but not immediately critical things needed in order to be addressed. This was not a failure of intention. It was a failure of priority, which was a different kind of failure, and in some ways a worse one, because it was not the result of forgetting, but of a series of daily small decisions to place other things first. Mara had been told, through a footman who had been among the 12 witnesses, and who had been quietly passing her information through a channel of simple professional courtesy that required nothing in either direction beyond the shared acknowledgement of what had happened, that a report had been made to the king. She received this piece of information without visible reaction, and with the internal calm of someone who had not expected a quick response, and was not troubled by the absence of one. She had learned long ago that accountability in hierarchical systems moved slowly, and often sideways before it moved directly, and she had no investment in the speed of anything in this building, except the investigation she was conducting, which was moving at the pace she was managing it, and which was, from that perspective, proceeding correctly. On the Wednesday after the tray incident, she found a legitimate reason to be outside the estate on a Tuesday morning errand rotation, a linen delivery confirmation task that Clara assigned to the lower floor staff on a rotating schedule. She had quietly arranged to take the slot that had originally been assigned to another staff member by offering to swap it for a dinner service rotation the other woman preferred, and Clara had noted and approved the change in the schedule without question, as Clara noted and approved all schedule adjustments that solved a staffing need without creating a problem elsewhere. She left through the service yard at 10:05, carrying the delivery confirmation clipboard, and moving at the pace of someone who had a specific destination and enough time to reach it without hurrying. The service road ran from the delivery yard along the eastern side of the estate wall and then turned south toward the junction with the main road, and she walked it in the clear October morning with the particular kind of sensory attention she brought to outdoor spaces, which was different from the close-quarters interior attention of a building, spread wider, more environmental, more attuned to spatial relationships and sight lines, and the way a person's movement looked from a distance. Grant left the kitchen at 10:12. She had positioned herself far enough ahead on the service road that his emergence from the delivery yard put her ahead of him on the same route, which meant she did not need to follow him. She was simply someone who had started her errand slightly earlier and was walking the same road, and the distance between them was the natural distance of two people on the same road, heading in the same direction, who had not acknowledged each other. He walked to the wooden post at the junction of the service road and the main lane. She continued past it toward the vendor's address, maintaining her pace without slowing, but at the distance she covered in passing she had a clear angle on what he did. He crouched beside the post on the side, facing away from the main lane, spent approximately 90 seconds doing something she could not fully resolve at that angle, straightened, spent 4 seconds looking both directions along the main lane, and walked back the way he had come. She completed the delivery confirmation at the vendor's address, took the documentation she needed, and walked back along the service road. When she reached the wooden post, she stopped and made a show of checking her clipboard as though reviewing the delivery note, and while her eyes were on the paper, her fingers found the loose knot on the back face of the post, the specific worn smoothness of repeated use around its edges, and the hollowed space behind it that had been cut out at some point with a tool and smoothed over time by regular handling. The space was empty now. Whatever Grant had placed had already been retrieved, or he had picked up something that had been placed earlier. She looked at the contact marker on the wood above the space, a small mark, subtle enough to be invisible to someone who was not looking for it, positioned to indicate that the drop was active. Dead drop, regular schedule, outside contact receiving from inside. She filed it and walked back to the estate. Ren Valos had told her, during her 5th year of training, when she was 17, and had come to him at the end of an exercise believing she had assembled a complete picture of a situation, that the phase of an investigation that felt most like completion was almost always the phase where the most important missing piece had not yet been found. He had listened to her full account and then asked her one question. Of all the pieces in the picture you have built, how many of them did you find yourself, and how many of them were placed where you could not fail to find them? She had thought about this for a long time. Then she had said that she was not certain she could distinguish reliably between the two categories. He had said that the inability to make that distinction reliably was the right place to be uncertain about it. He had said that the pieces that were easy to find were sometimes the pieces that were placed to be found, and that the appropriate response to a picture that felt complete was not satisfaction, but a more careful inventory of what was still missing. She thought about that lesson now, walking back from the dead drop post in the October morning, with the linen confirmation clipboard in her hands, and the service yard gate ahead of her. She had confirmed the dead drop. She had confirmed Grant's role. She had the locked room with the communications unit and the ledger. She had Felix Drum's corridor checks and his document-carrying exits and the forward fragment. She had the mud on his heel. She had all of these things, and they assembled into a picture that was becoming coherent. But what she did not yet have was the mechanism of the plan itself, the specific point at which the contract was intended to be executed, and the specific method intended to execute it. Without those two things, everything she had was circumstantial in the particular way that circumstantial evidence was useful for understanding a situation, but insufficient for stopping it. She needed the mechanism. She needed to know what they were actually going to do, and when, and with what. She walked back through the service yard gate and into the lower corridor, and returned the confirmation clipboard to the supply area, and resumed her scheduled afternoon tasks. She was 13 days inside the estate. The summit was 30 days away. she had more than enough time. That evening, in the hour before the lower floor quieted for the night, she observed Felix Drum for the fourth time, in a position that gave her useful information. He was in the ground floor corridor near the East Wing lobby at 7:22, moving slowly in the way of someone who was nominally walking somewhere, but was actually stationary in a moving form, which was the specific movement pattern of someone watching a space without appearing to watch it. She clocked the angle of his attention, which was oriented toward the corridor that led to the east basement stairwell, and then she clocked the moment he became aware of something that changed his posture by a fraction of a degree. One of the upper floor footmen had come into view at the far end of the corridor, and Felix Drum's body made the tiny adjustment of someone recalibrating their performance for an audience that had just entered the space. He continued walking. The footman passed. The corridor was empty again. What she had just observed was a person who was operating a sustained performance, who had their performance well enough under control that the adjustment was very small, but whose adjustment was visible to someone who was watching for exactly that quality of micro-movement. She filed it and continued to the kitchen to return the tray she was carrying, and that night, she added the observation to her developing intelligence picture and reviewed the picture from 3 different analytical angles before she was satisfied with her assessment of it. The picture was forming. She was close to something, and being close to something was precisely when she needed to be most careful, because closeness created a gravitational pull toward conclusions that were not yet fully supported, and conclusions reached too early were the most reliable way to let a threat complete itself before you were ready to stop it. She was not going to let that happen. She was going to be patient and precise, and she was going to find the mechanism. She closed her eyes and she went to sleep. The formal dinner that Friday evening was the occasion of a diplomatic reception for a delegation from the Western Territory. 12 people, including their senior representative, and 3 staffers, and 8 associated guests, all of whom had arrived 3 days earlier, and who had been, from the perspective of the upper floor staff managing their requirements, meticulous about the details of the table service, in a way that Clara Fenn had communicated to the serving staff on Wednesday, during the pre-event briefing, with the crisp efficiency of someone who needed them to understand exactly what was at stake, without speaking for any longer than the information required. Mara was assigned to the east side of the long table, which meant she was responsible for wine service and plate management on the right half of the Western delegation's seating section. She had served at 4 formal dinners since arriving at the estate, each progressively larger, and she had developed the practiced efficiency that good formal table service required. The anticipation of the moment a glass needed attention before the guest noticed it themselves, the movement through the occupied space around the table that displaced nothing and disturbed no ongoing conversation, the sustained neutral expression of professional attention that was, in her particular case, performing 2 functions simultaneously. The dining room was laid for 31, 12 Western delegation members, the Alpha King at the head, 6 of his senior staff along one side, 13 additional guests, ranging from the PAC's senior trade advisors to 2 territorial representatives, who had come as observers. The room ran at the particular volume of formal dinner conversation, which was always slightly louder than the participants intended, because the acoustics of long stone-walled rooms required projection, and projection from 31 simultaneous conversations created a background volume that caused everyone to raise their voice slightly more. Mara moved along the east side with her pitcher and her professional attention, and in the secondary layer of her awareness, she was working the room's geography against what she knew about Felix Drum's movement patterns and the 10-day observation she had been building. She had seen him in the outer corridor twice before the dinner began, which was unusual for a mid-level guest aide on an evening when the formal event occupying the dining room gave most of the building's ground floor a reason to be cleared for service access. He had a reason to be where he was, which was that he was a guest aide, and guest aides moved through the areas of the estate where their principals were operating, but his specific positions in the outer corridor had not corresponded to his principal's position, and this was a small discrepancy that she filed without acting on. She was refilling the 3rd glass from the right in the Western delegation seating section when Dorian Voss spoke. He did not raise his voice. He used the carrying projection of his normal speaking voice, which in a brief moment, between the conversations at his section of the table, was enough to create a local pocket of focus around his words. He said, with the smooth ease of a person making a measured observation rather than a pointed one, that the service on the east side of the table had been running behind the standard that the evening's occasion required. He said it looking at the middle distance, not at her specifically, in the way that people address a situation, rather than an individual, when they want the statement to land in the space between them. He said that he understood the east side assignment had been given to newer staff, which perhaps explained it. The local pocket of attention around his words widened, as the people nearest to it paused in their own conversations to hear what had prompted it. This included several members of the Western delegation, the PAC's senior trade advisor, and the Alpha King, who was seated 23 feet from where she was standing, and who turned his attention briefly from his conversation with the delegation's lead representative. He told her, in the level, carrying voice, to come to the center of the room and address the table regarding the quality of the service this evening. She stood with the wine pitcher in both hands, and she looked at the room, and she went. She walked to the center of the long dining room and stood there in the particular kind of silence that arrives when 31 people simultaneously have nothing they feel able to say, and she said, clearly and without any quality in her voice that could be identified as distress or as performance, that she was sorry for any disruption to the evening's service, and that she would ensure it did not happen again. The silence continued for a moment after she finished speaking. She was aware of it, with the full acuity of someone who has trained to remain functional in the center of unwanted attention. The 31 people, the positions of the servers along the room's edges, the particular stillness of the Alpha King, 2/3 of the way down the table. She looked at no one directly. She made herself available to be seen, and no more than that. Some people at the table looked at their plates. A few managed expressions of polite, careful non-reaction. One of the Western delegation representatives glanced briefly at the Alpha King with an expression that was not quite readable from her position, but that contained some element of expectation. The Alpha King looked at the table in front of him. Dorian said, in the tone of someone who has decided that a moment is complete, that she could return to her work. She returned to her work. She resumed the wine service on the east side of the table, and the dinner continued around her, and the conversations rebuilt themselves, and within 4 minutes, the room had largely absorbed the moment into its general noise, the way rooms always absorbed uncomfortable things when no one in them decided to hold the moment open. She moved through the rest of the dinner with the same steadiness she had brought to all of it, and in the secondary layer of her awareness, she was noting several things that were significant to her investigation, in ways that had nothing to do with the humiliation she had just been made to perform. The Alpha King had been present. He had been 23 feet away. He had looked at the table in front of him when the moment required a response, and had not made one. She added this to the tally of known occasions on which he had been in a position to respond, and had not, which now stood at 4. 3 staff reports, 1 direct witnessing. She also noted that the distraction created by Dorian Voss in the center of the dining room had occupied the complete attention of every person in it for approximately 65 seconds, including all 6 peripheral servers, including the 2 footmen positioned near the service entrance, including the senior footman, who normally maintained a scanning position toward the outer corridor door. 65 seconds of complete attentional vacancy in the building's occupants was a significant operational window. She served through the remaining 2 hours of the dinner, without drawing any further attention. When the guests moved to the reception room for the after-dinner portion, and the serving staff began clearing the table, Mara, during the movement and controlled noise of the table clearance, stepped away from the east side clearing team on the pretext of retrieving a dropped service item from near the service stairwell. She did not retrieve a service item. She went to Felix Drum's room. His room was on the 2nd floor in the guest wing, and she had noted its number on her second assignment to the guest corridor. The lock was simpler than the east basement utility room, and she was through it in 17 seconds. The room was ordered with the precision of someone who maintained control of their immediate environment as a professional habit. Clothes arranged methodically, personal items placed with deliberate intentionality. The travel bag beside the wardrobe was positioned in a way that suggested it had not been moved recently, which told her he was not in a preparation for departure phase. She checked the desk first, the underside of the surface, the base of the lamp, the inside of the drawer, the upper shelf of the wardrobe. She was moving toward the travel bag when she saw it. Tucked behind the small rectangular mirror on the desk, thin enough to be nearly invisible from any angle, except the specific one she was currently using, was a folded piece of paper approximately 5 centimeters by 4. She did not unfold it. She pressed it between 2 careful fingers and committed its texture, density, and the sharpness of the center fold to her memory. The paper was denser than ordinary stationery, the kind used for documents meant to be handled repeatedly, without degrading. The fold was recent. The crease was sharp in the way that a fold made days ago, rather than weeks ago, retained its edge. The exterior bore no markings visible from her angle. She replaced it exactly where she had found it, relocked the door in 14 seconds, and was back at the clearing table within her absence window. No one had registered her absence. That night, after Nora was asleep, she lay on her narrow bed and reconstructed everything she could from the brief examination of the document in Felix Drum's room, running the physical memory of it through her assessment framework until she had extracted everything it could offer without having been able to read it. The density of the paper and the sharpness of the recent fold together told her that it had been delivered recently, within the past 48 to 72 hours. The small size of the folded document relative to its apparent density told her that it was compact, that it contained a concentrated amount of information rather than extensive running text. These characteristics were consistent with a coded instruction document of the kind used in coordinated operations when verbal communication was not possible, and written communication needed to be both portable and reducible to something that could be rapidly destroyed if necessary. She needed to read it. She needed the right opportunity to return to his room when she had more than 17 seconds, enough time to unfold the document, read and memorize its contents, and refold it to its original creased configuration. She would find the opportunity. She was patient. She was always patient. She also thought, before she slept, about the 65 seconds in the dining room, the specific window that Dorian Voss had created in the building's occupants' attention, the fact that Felix Drum had been in the outer corridor twice before the dinner began. She did not know yet whether Dorian's behavior in the dining room was coordinated with Felix Drum's movements, or whether it was simply a coincidence of timing that a person paying close attention was right to examine carefully. She could not know without more information. She filed the question precisely where it belonged, in the open category, neither confirmed nor dismissed, requiring more data before it could be resolved. She closed her eyes. The building settled into its late-night quiet. In 27 days the summit would begin, and whatever was being coordinated in this building was going to be coordinated against that date, and she had 27 days to find the mechanism and the full network behind it. She was going to find them both. She thought about Ren Valos often during the 3rd week inside the estate, more than she usually allowed herself to think about him during active fieldwork, because something in the specific texture of this assignment kept producing situations that had exact parallels in things he had said or done during her training. He had a gift for designing exercises that were not obviously exercises until you were in the middle of them, training scenarios that began as one thing and became another, that required you to manage a transition in your understanding of the situation, while the situation itself was still running. The East Corridor had been one of those. The formal dinner had been another. The management of a public humiliation that was also a professional intelligence opportunity, performed in front of 12 witnesses and then 31, required a very specific quality of split attention that he had built in her through years of exactly this kind of layered practice. She remembered a session from her 7th year, when she was 19, and believed she had developed enough mastery of the basic emotional regulation disciplines that she was ready for the more advanced scenarios. Ren Valos had arranged a situation in which she was required to maintain her cover role in an exercise environment, while a second trainee played the role of someone with institutional authority who was systematically and publicly challenging her competence. The exercise ran for 4 hours. At the end of it, Ren Valos had asked her to describe what she had noticed about her own interior state at each stage of the 4 hours. She had given him an accurate account. He had listened without comment, and when she finished, he had said that the account was correct but incomplete, and that the incompleteness was in the moments where she had been most certain she was managing the situation well. Those were the moments, he said, where the management was actually masking something rather than resolving it, and the difference between masking and resolving was the difference between a skill that held under pressure and a skill that held until the pressure got specific enough. She had not fully understood what he meant until she was kneeling on the marble floor of the East Corridor at Cresthaven Estate, with 12 people watching and a decorated beta standing over her, and she had noticed that her hands were steady in the way that she had trained them to be steady, and that underneath that steadiness, there was something that was not anger and not fear, but was a very quiet and very patient recognition that this moment was information, that this man was showing her exactly who he was and exactly how he used the authority he carried, and that this information was going to be useful, and that the steadiness of her hands was not masking that recognition, but was the correct container for it. That was what resolving felt like. She had understood, in that moment, what Ren Valos had been trying to tell her. She thought about that as she walked back from the dead drop post on the Tuesday morning, carrying the delivery confirmation clipboard, watching the service yard gate come closer on the service road, feeling the change in the estate's atmosphere that she had sensed on her return. She thought about layers, the layer of what was visible, which was a servant returning from an errand, and the layer underneath it, which was a field operative who had just confirmed a significant piece of the intelligence picture she was building, and the layer underneath that, which was a person who had been taught by a serious and demanding instructor to understand that the most important information in any situation was almost always the information that was not immediately available. What was not immediately available to her now was the identity of the outside contractor and the precise mechanism of the execution plan. Those were the two pieces the picture was still missing. She would find them. She had found everything else. She went back to work. The letter arrived with the first post vehicle on a gray Tuesday morning, when low clouds sat over the valley, and the gravel paths outside the estate were dark with overnight rain. It came in among the routine estate correspondence, sealed with the formal emblem of the Eastern Combat Authority, which was not an organization the estate's administrative staff encountered in their daily processing of the king's correspondence, and which most of them would not have recognized from its seal alone. The post officer who sorted and routed the morning's correspondence placed it on the tray designated for the Alpha King's personal mail without any particular note attached to it, and it was carried upstairs at 8:15 and placed on the side table in the study, while Caius was in the middle of a meeting with two territorial advisors about the summit's agenda schedule. He saw it when there was a natural pause in the meeting, reached for it, the way he reached for his personal correspondence during working meetings, and read the first line of the return designation. Eastern Combat Authority, Field Operations Division. He read that line, and something shifted in the quality of his attention, the way a person's attention shifts when a name appears in an unexpected context, and the brain begins the rapid work of connecting what the name means in its known context with what it might mean in this one. The authority was not an organization that corresponded with Pack Estates about routine administrative matters. He could not recall, in his 7 years as Alpha King, ever receiving direct correspondence from the authority at all. He excused himself from the meeting. His advisors gathered their materials and left without question, because the Alpha King, excusing himself from a meeting with the calm certainty he was using now, was something they had both learned to receive without complication. He broke the seal and read the letter. He read it once through quickly, with the fast, structural reading he used for official communications when he needed the shape of a thing before he needed its detail. Then he set it flat on the desk and looked at it for a moment. Then he read it again, slowly, with the full reading, the kind that committed everything to immediate retention. When he finished reading it the second time, he sat very still. The letter informed him that the Eastern Combat Authority had placed an undercover operative in the Cresthaven estate staff in connection with a credible intelligence threat against his life, timed to the upcoming summit. It identified the operative by rank and classification. It requested his full cooperation with the field operation currently underway in his household. It requested discretion regarding the operative's identity and placement until the authority's coordinating agent arrived to manage the transition to the open operational phase. He read the rank designation again. Senior Shadow, Class 1. He was not an expert in the authority's classification system, but he knew enough of the general framework to understand that this was not a rank assigned to operatives in the early stages of their careers, or given for routine work. This was a designation reserved for people who had demonstrated verified capability across all dimensions of field operation, and whose track record was both long and consistently successful. He had received 3 written staff reports about an incident in the East Corridor, involving his beta and a lower-floor servant. He had been present at the formal dinner when the same servant had been made to stand in the center of the room and apologize to the table. He had looked at the surface of his desk during that moment and had not responded. He sat with those facts against the content of the letter he was holding, and he felt the specific discomfort of a person who has been presented with two things simultaneously: accurate information about what happened, and accurate information about what it meant. He called for Gareth Cole. Gareth Cole, the estate's head of internal security, was a compact man of 50, with close-cropped gray hair, who moved through the estate with the particular unhurried directness of someone who had managed security operations for long enough to understand that the wrong kind of urgency created more problems than it solved, and who had learned to make speed look like calm, because calm produced better outcomes than speed in most situations. He arrived in the study within 6 minutes of being summoned, which was, for Gareth, moving quickly without appearing to. Caius handed him the letter. Gareth read it standing, which was how Gareth read everything he considered operationally significant, and he made almost no visible expression while reading it, which was how Gareth received almost all information, because he had learned across 30 years of security work that the first expression was rarely the right one, and that the pause between receiving information and responding to it was where most of the quality of a response was determined. When he had finished, he looked up and was quiet for a moment. "She has been here for 23 days, Gareth said. "Yes," Caius said. "And I have a report about the East Corridor incident in the staff concerns file from 17 days ago." Caius said nothing. "And a second report from the formal dinner last Friday," Gareth said. "Yes," Caius said. Gareth set the letter on the desk and looked at it without speaking for another moment. What moved through his expression was not something Mara would have categorized as anger or shock, but something she might have recognized as the specific quiet of a professional who has encountered a gap in the systems they are responsible for maintaining and is determining, with complete honesty and no self-protection, exactly how large the gap is and where it originates. "I want her full file," Caius said. "Everything the authority has been willing to share, and everything we can access through our own channels. I want it in this room by noon." "Yes," Gareth said. "And do not tell Dorian," Caius said. Gareth looked at him for a brief moment, and then said, "Understood," and left. Mara was in the service corridor, on the lower floor, when the letter arrived upstairs. She was not aware of it in real time, because the intelligence operation she was running had no real-time communication channel with the authority, only the Saturday contact point at the bakery, and the unscheduled emergency channel she had used once after the dinner, when the operational picture had developed enough to require a transmission outside the regular schedule. She had made that unscheduled contact 8 days earlier, and had passed everything she had confirmed at that point, and she was now operating on the assumption that the authority was receiving her intelligence and incorporating it into whatever they were doing from their end. She had no way of knowing what that was. She was, as she always was on embedded assignments, operating with the information her position gave her access to, and trusting that the larger structure around the operation was doing its work correctly. What she did have, on the Tuesday morning when the letter arrived upstairs, was a different kind of awareness. She had followed Grant again on his 10 o'clock departure, covering the errand task pretext she had used the previous Tuesday, and she had confirmed what the previous observation had established: the dead drop post, the regular schedule, the collection-ready marker afterward. She had also, this time, positioned herself at a different angle from the previous week, and managed to get a clearer view of what Grant was doing at the post. Not retrieving, but depositing, which meant the communication flow was outward from the estate on this schedule, and inward, on another schedule that she had not yet observed. She walked back through the service yard gate at 10:34, and moved toward the lower corridor, and when she entered the corridor she felt it. She could not have described it immediately in words. It was not something visible. It was not something audible. It was a specific quality of the building's atmosphere, the air pressure of a household that was holding something differently than it had been holding it 20 minutes earlier. A subtle change in the way the sounds of the building related to one another, and the way the people moving through the corridors carried themselves. She had encountered this quality of atmospheric change before, in other embedded assignments, at the moment when something in the environment around her had shifted, without her having been part of the shift, and she had learned to treat the feeling as reliable information. Something had changed in the building while she was on the service road. She could not determine what it was yet. She did not try to determine it through anything other than observation, because attempting to accelerate the understanding of an atmospheric change by making direct inquiries was the kind of thing that registered as unusual behavior and caused exactly the kind of attention she could not afford. She resumed her afternoon task schedule, observed the building with the full depth of her attention, while her hands did the work they were assigned to do, and she was patient. She would know more by the end of the day. She usually did. Gareth Cole had the file on the desk in the Alpha King's study at 11:43, 17 minutes ahead of the noon deadline Caius had set, which was simply how Gareth operated when the situation was urgent enough to move ahead of a set deadline without making it look like moving. He had assembled what was available in 3 hours through the Estate Security Office's access to cross-territorial intelligence channels, and through what the Eastern Combat Authority had already included with the letter. And what was assembled in that 3-hour window was, even accounting for the significant classified material he could not access, considerable. The file was not thick. The authority maintained operational security on its active personnel, at a level that made most of what existed on their records inaccessible through standard intelligence channels. What Gareth had compiled was a combination of what the authority had chosen to share in the letter's attached documentation, and what could be confirmed through the PAC's own cross-territorial intelligence resources. Caius read through it seated at his desk, while Gareth stood near the window, because Gareth had understood from the moment the king said he wanted the file, that what followed the file was going to require a certain quality of space in the room, and standing near the window, rather than in the center of it, was the way Gareth gave that space without withdrawing from the room. The candidate profile, which was the authority's term for an operational dossier on an active agent, listed Mara Then's training history in the compressed but specific terms the authority used for its personnel documentation. 11 years of training under a senior instructor identified only by a program designation, which was the authority's standard practice for protecting the identities of its training staff. The program code indicated a curriculum in the top tier of what the authority certified. A program with a 40% first-year attrition rate, a completion rate across the full 11 years of less than 1 in 8, and a track record of producing field personnel whose operational outcomes across the authority's deployment history were among the best in its records. She had completed the full 11 years. Field deployment history. 4 assignments, all classified at the level that placed their specifics outside the PAC's accessible records. Outcome codes for all 4. Successfully completed. 2 commendations cited, without description of the specific acts they recognized, but issued at the rank of the authority's senior command structure, which did not issue commendations for routine field accomplishment. Current rank, Senior Shadow, Class 1. The footnote Gareth had added from the PAC's own intelligence glossary explained, this was the highest operational rank the authority assigned to field agents in active deployment. It was not honorary, not career achievement-based, not administrative. It reflected verified current capability across all dimensions of field operation. Caius read the entire file without looking up. When he finished, he set it flat on the desk and looked at it for a moment, and then looked at the window rather than at Gareth, which was something he did when he was thinking through something that required more than routine processing. He thought about what the file said, and he thought about the East Corridor, and the formal dinner, and the way he had received 3 reports, and attended 1 event, and had not responded with the speed and directness that any of those occasions had required. He did not soften this in his thinking. He let it stand at its full size, which was uncomfortable, and he stayed with the discomfort rather than moving away from it, because he had enough self-knowledge to understand that moving away from it quickly was simply a more comfortable version of the same failure he was already accounting for. I want to speak with the authority's field operations lead directly, he said to Gareth, and I want to know who their coordinating agent is for this region. I can have the contact line within an hour, Gareth said. Do it. And the daily assignment for the operative. Is she working today? Lower floor corridor detail. She came back from an outside errand about 90 minutes ago. Make sure nothing changes for her today. Nothing in her schedule that could signal that something has shifted on our end. Understood, Gareth said. He left. Caius picked up the file and read through it a second time. On the second reading, the specific details landed differently than they had on the first, which was always what happened with significant information. The first read established the structure, and the second read filled in the weight. The 4 completed assignments with their outcome codes carried a different weight when read in the context of a living person currently moving through the estate's lower floor corridor. She had done this kind of work before. She had done it 4 times. She had not failed. She was doing it now, in his household, while the people in his household had been treating her as something they could look through. He put the file down and looked at the far wall. He had a decision to make about how the next phase of this was going to be handled, and the decision involved Dorian, and the conversation with Dorian was going to require him to be accountable for his own failures before and while he made Dorian accountable for his. He had known, since reading the letter, that this conversation was coming. He had not been avoiding it. He had been preparing for it, which was different, because preparation in this case required something that was more costly than most things he was asked to do in the ordinary course of his work. It required him to say something true about himself in front of the person he was also holding accountable. That was not the kind of thing that got easier with time, but it was the kind of thing that got more correct with thought, and he intended to think it through properly before he opened that door. The authorities' field contact, a man named Owen Hale, was on the secure line within 50 minutes. He was brief and cooperative in the specific way of someone who had been managing a sensitive situation carefully, and was now deciding how much of the management needed to transfer to the local authority, and how much needed to remain with him. He confirmed the broad picture. He told Caius that the authorities' assessment of the operative's progress to date was that the intelligence picture was advancing on schedule, and that the summit was still the correct operational window. He told Caius that their coordinating agent for the final phase would be arriving at the estate within 48 hours, and that his name was Leon Crail. Caius said he would have accommodation arranged. Owen Hale said that Leon Crail would prefer the service guest accommodation, and that if his arrival could be handled without formal announcement, that would be strongly preferred. Caius said he understood. He did understand, more than Owen Hale perhaps expected, because he was beginning to understand with some depth what it meant to have an operation of this seriousness running quietly inside a building that had not been treating quiet and serious things with the care they deserved. He spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing the summit security protocols with Gareth, now with the additional layer of information about what was actually moving inside his building and why, and the review took 3 times as long as it normally would have, because there was now a great deal more to account for. He did not speak to Dorian that day. He saw him at the morning briefing, and again at the evening security report, and both times, he maintained the surface of his normal interaction, because that was what the situation required, until Leon Crail arrived, and the plan for the next phase was established. But he was thinking about it. He was thinking about it in the specific, concentrated way he thought about things that he needed to do correctly, and he was going to continue thinking about it until he was certain he knew exactly what correctly required. In the basement corridor below him, Mara was completing her last task of the afternoon and preparing for the evening meal service, and she could still feel the change in the building's atmosphere that she had walked into when she came back from the service road that morning, and she was patient and watchful, and she did not yet know what it was, but she was going to find out. And in the meantime, she continued her work with the steady competence she brought to all of it, and she kept her eyes open, and she waited for the picture to complete itself. She spent the walk back from the dead drop post reviewing everything she had assembled in 3 weeks, inside Cresthaven, running through the intelligence picture, with the analytical discipline she had been trained to bring to it, starting from what was confirmed, moving through what was strongly indicated, ending with what remained genuinely open. The confirmed items were several and specific. The locked room in the east basement passage and its communications equipment, its coded ledger, its supply boxes of unmarked equipment, the dead drop post at the service road junction, and Grant's regular 10 o'clock Tuesday departures to service it. Felix Drum's corridor checks aimed at the east wing approach, the forward fragment from behind the partly open door. The document in Felix Drum's room, which she had confirmed was a recently delivered compact document of the type used for coded instructions. The strongly indicated items were 2, the outside contractor who would come in during the summit's execution window, and the specific method of execution, which she had not confirmed but which the supply boxes in the locked room, the communications equipment, and the kitchen supervisor's involvement suggested was not a direct physical attack on the Alpha King but something more subtle, something that required access to the food preparation chain and time to prepare. Poison, or something functionally equivalent, an environmental modification rather than a direct intervention, the kind of plan that a professional network ran when they had inside access and needed plausible deniability on the outside contractor, because the contractor's role would be the delivery of the specific agent, not the personal execution of the act. She filed this as strongly indicated, rather than confirmed, because she did not yet have the specific evidence to move it to the confirmed category, and moving things to confirmed before they were confirmed was the kind of analytical error that cost operations their integrity. The genuinely open item was the contractor's identity and the specific delivery method and timing. These were the things she needed most and had the least of, and they were the things the summit would surface, because the contractor would not come in before the execution window. She was thinking about all of this as she walked through the service yard gate and into the lower corridor, and then the atmosphere of the building registered on her in the specific way it had registered, like a room whose air pressure had changed without the door being opened, and she put the analytical review away and returned to the present and the estate and the specific changed quality of the air around her. She did not know what had changed. She would find out. In the meantime, she returned to her afternoon tasks and kept her attention at its full depth and waited. By the end of the day, she had gathered 3 small pieces of information that together suggested the change in the building's atmosphere was originating from the upper floors. She had observed Gareth Cole move through the lower corridor at a time that was unusual for him, with a folder under his arm, and the specific quality of focus that Gareth brought to tasks that had been elevated in priority above the routine level. She had heard the Alpha King's personal secretary speak briefly to one of the senior footmen about a schedule change that moved 2 of the afternoon's planned meetings to the following morning, and she had noticed that the footman assigned to the upper residential wing was moving through his assignments slightly faster than his normal pace, which was the pace of a person who had been given additional tasks and was working to accommodate them without falling behind on the existing ones. None of these 3 observations would have meant anything individually. Together they indicated that something had arrived in the upper floor operation that had reorganized priorities without reorganizing the visible surface of the building's routine, which was the specific kind of change that happened when information arrived that was too significant to ignore, but too sensitive to respond to visibly. She went to sleep that night without having resolved what the change was. She did not try to force a resolution. She was patient. The information would surface. Everything surfaced eventually, if you stayed in position long enough and paid enough attention, and she was very good at both. When the coordination team arrived 2 days later in the form of Leon Crail and his 2 accompanying colleagues, she was in the lower floor corridor completing the morning schedule, and the change in the building's atmosphere resolved itself entirely into its correct explanation, and she understood what had shifted and what it meant for the operation's next phase. She received the briefing through the secure internal channel Gareth had established, and she made no visible adjustment to her morning's activities for the remainder of the day, because that was what the briefing required of her, and because she had been doing this kind of work long enough that the discipline of the requirement was simply how she operated. But in the part of her that was always working, she was already thinking about what came next. The formal hearing regarding Dorian Voss was one thing. The transition to an open operational role was another. The summit was the third, and the third was the one that everything else existed to enable. She had 6 days until it began. She intended to spend all of them getting ready. The file that Gareth had assembled on her credentials and training history was reviewed by Leon in the service guest room on the morning of his arrival, and his reading of it confirmed what the field reports she had been transmitting had already established, that the intelligence picture she had built was accurate, thorough, and operationally actionable. He had not expected otherwise. Owen Hale's field operatives did not build inaccurate intelligence pictures, and among Owen Hale's field operatives, Mara then had a specific reputation for building pictures with a completeness and a precision that had made the difference, in 2 of her 4 previous assignments, between operations that closed their full network and operations that closed only the visible portion. He told her this during their first working meeting in the coordination room, not as a compliment, but as a statement of operational context, because Leon Crail did not offer compliments in working environments and had no particular philosophy about whether they were valuable. He simply communicated what was relevant to the operation. And what was relevant in this case was that the intelligence she had produced was the foundation of everything the summit phase was going to be built on, and that the foundation was sound. She said that she understood, and she went back to work. Leon Crail arrived at the service gate at 6 in the morning, on the second Thursday after the letter, while the valley was still dark and the gravel paths were damp with morning dew. He came in a plain vehicle with no markings, wearing clothes that were practical and unremarkable. Dark trousers, a heavy jacket, shoes that had seen enough use to be comfortable without being worn out. He was accompanied by 2 people he did not introduce by name to the gate guard, who had been told only that the Alpha King was expecting a security consultant at this hour, and that the arrival should be logged without detail. The two people with Leon moved with a specific quality of composed readiness that the gate guard, who had been doing his job for 11 years and had seen many kinds of people come through, recognized without being able to name, and he waved them through without the extra second of scrutiny he would have given visitors of whom he was less certain. Gareth Cole met them at the service entrance personally. He showed them to the service guest accommodation on the lower second floor, gave Leon the current briefing file that he and Caius had assembled in the days since the letter arrived, and left them to read it, because he understood that intelligence professionals read better when no one was in the room waiting for their reaction. Leon Crail was in his early 40s, tall, with the kind of face that had once been striking and had settled over the years into something more functional. The face of a person whose most important features were their attentiveness and their stillness rather than their appearance. He spoke with the economy of someone who had worked in field operations long enough to know that everything essential could be said in fewer words than most people used, and who had organized his communication around that principle over the course of a long career. He listened the way field operatives who had been at the top of their work for a long time listened, which was completely, and without any of the partial attention that most people divided between what they were hearing and what they were planning to say next. He read the briefing file in the service guest room, slept for 3 hours, reviewed the intelligence Mara had transmitted through the authorities' internal channels since her placement began, and arrived at the Alpha King's study at 9 in the morning with the particular quality of a person who is ready and who does not need to perform readiness, because the readiness itself is simply present. Caius had decided before the meeting that he was going to speak plainly. He had been thinking about the shape of the conversation since the letter had arrived, and he had settled on this. He was not going to cushion the account of what had happened with any of the language people used when they were trying to reduce the cost of their own accountability. He was not going to say that he had intended to address the incidents, or that his attention had been required elsewhere, or that the staff reporting system had routed the information in a way that made it difficult for him to prioritize. All of those things were true. None of them changed what had happened. He was going to say what had happened, plainly, and he was going to say what his role in it was, and then he was going to move forward to what needed to happen next. He told Leon what the file had told him. He told him about the East Corridor. He told him about the formal dinner. He told him that he had received 3 formal reports from members of his staff describing the first incident, and that he had been present at the second, and that he had not responded to either with the speed and directness that they required. He said it plainly and without elaboration. Leon listened to all of it without interrupting. He said that the operative had been managing the situation without any of the support structure that a standard deployment would have provided, because the standard support structure would have compromised the cover that the assignment required. He said that she had done this without apparent difficulty, that her intelligence transmissions had been detailed and operationally sound, and that the picture she had assembled from inside the estate was now sufficient to establish the full mechanism of the threat and the identity of the inside network, though not yet the outside contractor. "How close is she to the contractor?" Caius asked. "The contractor will not come in until the execution window," Leon said. "The inside network handles the preparation and the confirmation. The contractor comes in for the final step. We don't know the contractor's identity yet. Neither does she. But we will know them when they move, because we will have everything else in place by then. What do you need from me?" Leon said 2 things. The first was that the summit needed to proceed as planned, because the threat was embedded inside the summit window, and the summit was where the full network could be caught, not before it and not after it. Canceling or postponing the summit would scatter the network before it could be fully closed, and a scattered network with a live contract was more dangerous than one with a fixed execution window and a surveillance team in position. Caius nodded. He had expected this. The second thing Leon said was about Dorian. Caius waited. Leon said that the beta's behavior toward the operative had created a documented record of public incidents that needed to be addressed before the operative transitioned from covert to open operational role within the estate's security structure. He said it was not a recommendation. He said it needed to happen, that it needed to be witnessed, and that the operative needed to be present, in her field identification, with her credentials visible. He said the specific form that the acknowledgement took was Caius's decision, but the acknowledgement itself was not optional. Caius said he understood. He asked for 2 days to prepare it properly. during which the current surveillance protocols would remain unchanged, and nothing visible would alter in the building's routine. Leon agreed. He said that Mara would be briefed through a secure internal channel that Gareth had established within the hour, and that she would not react to the briefing in any way that would be visible in her normal activity, because she never did. Caius looked at Leon for a moment and said, "I know." He had read her file twice. He believed it. The conversation with Dorian arrived on a Saturday morning in the form of a summons to the East Courtyard, under the pretext of a routine security posture review, which was a category of meeting Dorian attended regularly, and which had no particular signal attached to it that would cause him to approach it differently from any other meeting. Caius had chosen the East Courtyard specifically because it was enclosed, and because the row of arched windows that lined the second-floor corridor overlooking it gave a clear view of everything that happened in the courtyard below to anyone working or moving through that level of the building during the meeting's scheduled time. Several members of the staff who had witnessed the East Corridor incident had their regular Saturday morning assignments in that section of the building. What had happened in that corridor had been public. It had been public by design, staged for the maximum available audience, executed with the precision of someone who understood the social mechanics of public humiliation well enough to calibrate it. The response could not be private. The response needed to hold the shape of what it was responding to. Dorian arrived at the East Courtyard at exactly the scheduled time, which was a quality Caius had always respected about him. His punctuality was genuine, the expression of someone who took his professional commitments seriously, as a matter of personal standard. He wore his formal jacket and carried himself with the composed authority that he carried into every meeting with the king, the particular readiness of a man who had served in close proximity to command for long enough that the readiness was simply his natural state. He stopped when he saw Mara. She was standing on the far side of the courtyard with Leon Crail. She was not in the gray uniform of the lower floor staff. She was wearing field clothing, dark and practical, and fitted for movement, and she carried the identification credentials of the Eastern Combat Authority clipped to the front of her jacket, at the position that made them immediately visible to anyone looking in her direction. Leon stood beside her in the position of a professional colleague, which was exactly what he was. Dorian looked at her. He looked at Leon. He looked at the king. His face went through something complicated in the space of about 4 seconds, a series of adjustments that worked through several possible framings of the situation, before settling on the controlled, guarded expression of a man who had decided that determining the dimensions of a situation before committing to any response within it was his best available strategy. Caius did not give him time to speak. He said, "This is Leon Crail, the coordinating agent for the Eastern Combat Authority's current field operation in this estate, and I believe you have had some contact with his colleague." Dorian was quiet. Caius told him what the file said. He did not summarize it. He read from it directly, moving through the sections that mattered with the same level voice he used in official proceedings, because this was an official proceeding and it required that register. He read the rank. He read the training history and its classification. He read the field deployment record and its outcome codes. He read the current assignment and the date it had begun, which placed her inside the estate for the full period that included both incidents. He read all of it without emphasis, because the facts themselves were sufficiently emphatic. Dorian listened. His expression did not shift significantly during the reading, which was not the absence of reaction, but the management of it. The specific controlled surface of a man whose pride was large enough to maintain its exterior smoothness, even while something was pressing against it from behind with considerable force. When Caius finished reading, he said, "I want you to understand clearly what has happened here. An operative of this rank was placed in this building by the authority to protect my life. She was placed in a covert position because the nature of the threat required it. While she was performing that function, you publicly humiliated her in front of 12 people, and then required her to perform a public apology in front of 31, including members of a visiting diplomatic delegation. I was informed of the first incident, and I was present at the second, and I did not respond to either with the speed or the directness that both occasions required. I am prepared to account for that failure." He paused. "You are also going to account for yours," he said. Dorian said, in the voice of a man whose footing had shifted and who was reaching for something stable, that he had not known who she was. There was a silence. He said it again, differently this time, that he had simply been managing the standards of the estate, that he had had no way of knowing, that the situation surely had a proper context that could be understood correctly if everyone was reasonable about it. And then, in the specific way that a man with a long career of being powerful reaches for power in the moments when it has been most visibly removed from him, he looked at Mara and said something under his voice, directed at the space between himself and Leon, rather than at anyone specifically, a comment about the nature of her assignment, about the category of work that required operating as domestic staff, about whether that category of work could really be considered field work in the same sense as other kinds, and the phrasing he chose to make this point was dismissive, in a way that was not incidental. He finished the sentence. The courtyard was completely quiet. Leon Crail turned his head slightly toward Mara. It was not a command. It was the specific small acknowledgement of a senior colleague, indicating that a response was appropriate, and that the response was hers to make. Caius looked at Mara. He did not nod, exactly, but something in his expression was an opening. She set her credentials badge on the low stone ledge beside her. She walked toward Dorian across the courtyard without hurrying, without any of the performative quality that would have made it theatrical, with the same measured pace she brought to everything. When she was close enough, she told him, quietly and without any particular expression in her voice, that she was going to demonstrate something briefly and that he should brace himself. He began to say something. He did not finish it. What followed lasted 43 seconds. She had counted it afterward because Ren Valos had told her to always know exactly how long something took, in case it was ever questioned, and someone usually questioned things they had witnessed, if the questioning gave them any control over the account. 43 seconds. 4 movements, 2 transitions between positions, 1 controlled conclusion that placed Dorian on the courtyard stone, with her standing over him with the complete and unhurried control of someone who had never for a single moment been using her full capacity. She had applied exactly what the demonstration required, and nothing more. No pain, no injury, just the pure, clean statement of a technical fact. She stepped back. She straightened the front of her jacket. She retrieved her credentials badge from the ledge and clipped it back in position. In the corridor above, where the arched windows gave a clear view of the courtyard below, 3 members of the Saturday morning staff had stopped what they were doing and were looking through the windows at the scene below, with the particular stillness of people who had witnessed something that they did not yet fully have the context for, but that they understood was significant. The courtyard was completely silent. Dorian got to his feet. He did it slowly, and without any of the speed that a man in his position normally used to demonstrate that a physical setback was not a setback, which told her that the physical experience had been sufficiently disorienting, that the performance was not available to him yet. When he was upright, he looked at the stone for a moment before he looked at anyone. He did not make another comment. The summit was 2 days away when the estate entered the heightened operational mode that always preceded a large formal gathering of significant diplomatic and political weight. 12 additional service staff arrived to manage the catering and room service requirements of 6 visiting delegations, each with their own staffers and aides and accompanying personnel. The estate's formal security division expanded its perimeter positions and increased its corridor coverage in the ways that a building of this type added security for a major event. Not dramatically, because drama drew attention, but thoroughly, in the accumulated small ways that added to a significantly more comprehensive security posture, without appearing to change much on the surface. Mara moved through all of it in an entirely different capacity. She was no longer in the gray uniform of the lower floor staff. She was no longer functioning as something the estate could look through. She wore the dark, practical field clothing of the authorities' coordination team, her credentials visible on the front of her jacket, and she moved through the estate with the full access and the full authority of a member of the joint security operation that Gareth and Leon had established in the 48 hours since the courtyard confrontation. Gareth had integrated her into his security team with the particular unglamorous professionalism that defined his management of everything. He had brought her into the briefing on Thursday morning, introduced her to his 4-person team without preamble, and told them that she had more relevant experience for this specific operation than anyone else in the room, and that they were going to treat her operational assessment as authoritative. His team had received this without visible difficulty. The story of what had happened in the East Courtyard had moved through the estate's staff structure with the particular speed that stories in closed environments travel when they carry the weight of something people have been waiting to understand. The 12 witnesses from the East Corridor, the 31 people from the formal dinner, the 3 staff members who had watched through the arched windows on Saturday morning. The story had moved. It had moved the way certain kinds of truth move, not loudly, not with announcement, but with the specific quiet certainty of something that was always going to be true, regardless of whether anyone had said it yet. On the first full day of her integrated role, Mara walked the estate with Gareth and mapped the existing surveillance coverage against what she had learned about Felix Drum's movement patterns and Grant's operational schedule across the previous 3 weeks. The gaps she identified were not failures of the existing security posture. They were the natural vulnerabilities of a security system designed for standard estate operations, and they would have been adequate against a standard threat. But the threat she was managing was not standard. It had been running inside the building for a significant period, had learned its rhythms in detail, and was planning around what it knew. She and Gareth adjusted the coverage in 3 specific locations: the East Basement Passage, the delivery yard access point, and the service corridor section that connected the kitchen wing to the east stairwell. Each adjustment was made by repositioning existing personnel to new positions rather than adding new ones, which was the kind of change that did not register as a visible shift in the security posture to someone who was watching for one. She also used the time before the summit began to identify something she had not previously placed in her operational picture. The Southern PAC delegation arrived on the day before the summit's formal opening, a group of 11 that included their senior representative, 4 advisors, 2 observers, and the associated support staff. Among the support staff, listed on the delegate roster as a mid-level aide to the second trade representative, was a man named Philip Ashe. He was in his late 30s, with the practiced pleasantness of a person in a political-adjacent professional role, who had attended events of this kind many times, and had developed a smooth, undemanding social presence that moved through rooms without friction. Mara noticed him in the East Wing lobby at 3 in the afternoon of the pre-summit day. She noticed him because of a sequence of 2 observations that occurred within 6 seconds of each other. The first, he glanced toward the cross corridor that led to the East Basement Passage, in a way that was brief enough to be natural for someone orienting to an unfamiliar building, but that was directed with a precision that was not the imprecision of general orientation. The second, Felix Drum came through the lobby from the opposite direction 30 seconds after Philip Ashe, and neither of them produced any form of mutual acknowledgement. 2 people who know each other, placed in social proximity in a shared space, produce some form of micro-acknowledgement regardless of their effort not to. It may be nothing more than a shared micro-quality in the gaze, as they register each other's presence, lasting a fraction of a second. But it is present, and its presence is readable by someone who has been trained specifically to read it. The absence of any acknowledgement between 2 people who pass within speaking distance in a lobby is not the absence of a relationship. It is the practiced management of a relationship that neither party wishes to have observed. She went to Leon that evening and told him what she had seen. He confirmed that this placed Philip Ashe as the secondary inside contact that the authority had been tracking through outside channels, without being able to position inside the estate. He confirmed that the arrest sequence could not begin until the outside contractor came in, because removing 2 of the inside network's 3 components before the contractor moved would scatter the third piece and close the window on the full network. They discussed timing. She gave him her assessment, the second evening of the summit, based on the behavioral pattern she had been tracking in Felix Drum over the previous weeks, which showed the specific tightening of behavior that indicated someone in the final preparation phase of an operation they had been building toward for an extended period. Leon agreed with the assessment. He asked for contingency options for timelines later than that. She told him she would have them at 6 the following morning. She spent the night working through them and delivered them at 5:58. The summit opened the next day, with the formal arrival of all 6 delegations, and a morning reception in the main hall that established the social and diplomatic temperature for the days ahead. Mara moved through the periphery of the reception as part of the expanded security presence, observed without being the object of observation, and tracked the building's operational geography with the full depth of her attention. Philip Ashe worked the reception with professional ease. Felix Drum did not attend the reception, which was consistent with his behavioral pattern in the lead-up to the execution window. Grant ran his kitchen section through the preparation for the summit's first formal dinner with the practiced efficiency she had been observing for 3 weeks. The first day of the summit passed without the specific incident she was watching for. The formal dinner was excellent. 3 territorial agreements were initiated for full signing on the summit's final day. The Alpha King moved through the event with the political ease of someone who had been doing this for years, and who was, additionally, operating with the knowledge of what was actually in motion in his building, and the specific quality of composure that knowledge requires when you cannot show it. She went to the coordination room at midnight and reviewed the updated surveillance map with the on-duty member of Gareth's team. She confirmed the positions for the following evening's operational coverage, the coverage that was designed around the second evening window she had assessed. She went to her room. She slept for 4 hours, which was the sleep of someone who had determined exactly what the following day required of them, and who needed to be ready for all of it. The second day had a different quality. She could feel it in herself when she woke, which she acknowledged without concern, because she had been in this state before, and she knew it. The particular calibrated alertness that arrived when an operation was approaching its resolution, the sharpening of attention across every sense, that was not anxiety, but the body's way of aligning itself with the specific demands of what was coming. She ate a full breakfast. She ran her movement sequences in the coordination room before 6 in the morning. She reviewed every position and every contingency one final time, and found nothing she would change. She was ready. The second day of the summit was, on the surface, unremarkable. The delegations met, the sessions ran, the reception rooms filled and emptied in the rhythm of a large diplomatic event, moving through its agenda. Mara moved through it at the periphery, observing, tracking the positions of the people she was watching, noting the gradual tightening of Felix Drum's behavior across the day that confirmed her timing assessment, noting the moment in the late afternoon when Philip Ashe moved through the East Wing lobby and paused at the cross-corridor entrance for approximately 2 seconds before continuing, which was a pause that told her the go signal had been given or was imminent. She went to the coordination room and told Leon. Leon activated the positions. The evening of the summit's second day was beginning. The estate was quiet, in the specific way of a building that is holding something significant in its upper floors, while the lower floors continue their ordinary rhythms, and Mara moved through that quiet, with the awareness of someone who understood both layers of it simultaneously. She was no longer in the gray uniform of the lower floor staff, but she was not unaware of the lower floor staff. She knew which of them had watched through the arched windows of the second floor corridor when the courtyard confrontation happened. She knew which of them had been among the 12 witnesses in the east corridor and the 31 in the formal dining room. She knew, from the particular way they moved through the building in the days after the courtyard meeting, that the story had reached them in the specific form in which stories reach people in closed environments, not with fanfare, but with a specific quiet certainty that told her the truth of the matter had been communicated clearly enough. She did not seek out those conversations, and she did not avoid them. She moved through the building in her new role, with the same measured quality she had brought to the old one, present, attentive, not performing anything. If a member of the lower floor staff looked at her with a particular quality of recognition as she passed, she returned the look with the same steady neutrality she brought to everything, and continued on her way. She had 4 days between the courtyard confrontation and the opening of the summit, and she used them with the same thorough care she had given to everything else in this assignment. She walked every level of the estate with Gareth, verifying the surveillance adjustments she had recommended, confirming that the repositioned personnel understood their new positions and the specific behaviors they were watching for. She reviewed the summit's delegate roster in full, cross-referencing every name against the intelligence files Leon had brought, and when she reached Philip Ashe's name on the Southern PAC's delegate staff list, she noted it and flagged it for the working file, without yet having specific intelligence to attach to the flag. The flag was instinct refined by pattern recognition across 3 previous assignments, the specific sense of a name that appeared in a context where it should not appear as prominently as it did. She paid attention to that sense. She also spent time each of the 4 mornings in the coordination room with the movement sequences she maintained as a daily discipline, working through them slowly and completely, every angle, every transition, every position. Not because she expected a direct physical confrontation in a building with this level of operational security in place, but because the discipline had a value that went beyond its practical application. It was the specific kind of daily practice that kept the interior environment aligned with the exterior demands of the work, and she had found across 4 assignments that the alignment held better when the practice was consistent and unhurried, rather than performed urgently, when a specific situation seemed to require it. Ren Valos had made this point during her 4th year of training, using a phrase she had thought about many times since. He had said that the people who were available when the situation required them were the people who had been practicing availability every day when the situation did not require it. She had thought about this and asked what availability meant in that context. He had said, the complete alignment of the body and the mind, and the judgment with whatever is actually happening, as opposed to what you expected to be happening, or what you have been trained to expect. Availability was the absence of lag between reality and response, and the absence of lag required practice, because lag was the default state of most human beings when they encountered something genuinely unexpected. She had been practicing for 11 years. She did not have lag. What she had was the specific readiness of someone for whom the unexpected had become, through sustained exposure, simply another category of the expected. She was ready for the summit. She was also ready for Philip Ash. The confirmation that Philip Ash was the secondary inside contact came in the East Wing lobby on the afternoon of the pre-summit day, in the form of the 2 observations that occurred within 6 seconds of each other, and that told her what she needed to know, without requiring any additional evidence. The precision of his glance at the east basement passage corridor entrance, the absence of micro-acknowledgement when Felix Drum came through the lobby 30 seconds after. She had been trained to read both of these signals, and she had read them clearly. She took her assessment to Leon that evening and presented it without embellishment, simply the observations, and the conclusion they supported, and the operational implication. Leon listened and confirmed, and they adjusted the plan for the summit's 2nd evening to account for the 3-position arrest requirement rather than the 2-position arrest she had originally assessed. They had additional work to do before the summit opened the following morning. They did it, and when it was done they were ready. And when they were ready, the summit opened, and the work began its final phase. The contractor entered the estate at 9:43 on the 2nd evening of the summit, in a delivery vehicle that was physically identical to the one used by the estate's regular evening supply service. The identity of the vehicle was not the deception. The same model, the same service company markings on the side, the same general profile that the gate guard had cleared on the same schedule for the past 2 years. The deception was that the vehicle was not the correct vehicle, and the driver was not the correct driver. The correct vehicle had been intercepted on the approach road 18 minutes earlier, stopped under the pretext of a road obstruction check that Leon's external surveillance team had arranged as part of the operational preparation. The driver had been secured without injury, and the vehicle had been taken, the contractor installing themselves in the driver's position and moving toward the estate gate at precisely the time the regular delivery was expected. The gate guard cleared the vehicle at 9:44. The signal from Leon's external team reached Mara at 9:46, through the communication device Gareth had issued to the full joint security team. She was already moving through the 2nd-floor service corridor toward the east wing when the signal came, which meant the signal confirmed a decision she had already begun to execute, which was the way it worked when you had spent enough time in a position to understand it. The signal and the movement arrived at the same moment because the reading of the situation and the communication of the reading were running on the same timeline. She changed direction based on the signal's specific content, which confirmed that the vehicle had been substituted and gave the contractor's direction of entry from the service yard. She moved to the observation position that gave her the delivery route's full sightline, and waited. The delivery vehicle was in the service yard. The contractor emerged with a supply carton and moved toward the kitchen delivery entrance at the pace of a driver who had made this same delivery many times and knew the route. From the position she had taken, she had a clear angle on the approach, and she watched the contractor's movement with the particular attention she brought to people she was assessing for the first time in a live context, noting the physical parameters and the movement quality and the specific direction of the eyes when the contractor cleared the service yard and entered the delivery corridor. The eyes went toward the east basement passage. Not the kitchen, the east passage. She moved. She took the service stairwell that brought her out at the east passage's far end, which put her ahead of the contractor's position, rather than behind it, and gave her the specific advantage of knowing the space in complete detail after 3 weeks of moving through it daily. She moved into the alcove across from the locked room door, and stood in the shadow there, her breathing even, her body completely still, her attention fully on the sounds of the corridor, as the contractor's footsteps approached from the main entrance end of the passage. In the kitchen wing, at that same moment, Gareth's officer was positioned at the service window above the kitchen section where Grant was working. In the East Wing guest level, the second of Leon's accompanying team was at the position they had established outside Philip Ash's room during the afternoon, positioned to make the arrest quietly when the signal came. In the ground floor East corridor, Leon himself was in a position covering the route Felix Drum had been observed using for his document-carrying exits over the course of the previous 3 weeks. 4 positions, 1 signal, coordinated timing. The footsteps in the East Passage came around the corner. The contractor was 3 steps into the passage when the sight line from the entrance to the alcove opened, and in the half-second between when the contractor's eyes registered the alcove and when the contractor could react to what they were registering, Mara had already closed the distance. The carton hit the stone floor. She did not describe it to herself as she did it. That was not how it worked. Ren Valos had spent years making the point that description and execution occupied mutually exclusive spaces in the brain, and that the presence of one guaranteed the absence of the other, and that the body needed to be capable of the work without any input from the describing part of the mind. She had built that capability over 11 years, and 4 assignments, and every training session she had run in every early morning, in every coordination room of every building where she had been placed, and now it was simply there, available and complete, and she used it. 4 movements, 2 transitions, 9 seconds from the first contact to the conclusion. The contractor was on the floor, with hands secured by the restraints she had carried in the inside pocket of her field jacket since the morning of the first summit day, and she was standing in the East Passage, with her breathing still even, still fully present, still in complete command of the situation. She spoke into the communication device. East Passage, contractor secured. Gareth's voice came back within 3 seconds. Kitchen team has Grant. He was at the preparation station. A pause of approximately 4 seconds. Then Leon's voice. East Wing guest room. Philip Ash in custody. Felix Drum secured in the main corridor. She stood in the East Basement Passage and looked at the locked room door, which stood opposite her at a distance of perhaps 2 meters, and she looked at the contractor on the floor with the professional thoroughness of someone making sure that a task has been completed to the correct standard, and not simply to the visible standard. She looked at the supply carton where it had landed, the corner of it cracked against the stone. She took one slow, full breath. Upstairs, in the dining room where 62 people were gathered around a table laid with the formal service of a summit that had mattered enormously to 6 different territorial entities, the evening was continuing. Caius was at the head of the table. The conversations of 6 delegations moved through the second evening's agenda. The wine was being poured by people who had no knowledge of what had just happened in the East Basement Passage below them. The food was being served from a kitchen in which a man named Grant had just been quietly removed from his station by a security officer whose intervention had taken 45 seconds and had required no interruption to the kitchen's output. The eastern guest corridor was clear of its detained occupants, with the kind of silence that deliberate professional action produces when it is executed correctly. No one at the table had heard anything. No one at the table would know until they were told, at a time and in a manner chosen by the Alpha King, that anything had happened at all. That was what success looked like in this kind of work. Not noise, not drama, the threat simply not completing itself, in a room full of people who had no idea that it had been about to. She waited in the East Passage until the coordination team arrived to take custody of the contractor, walking them through the handoff with the thoroughness she brought to every transfer of a secured person, making sure every detail of the documentation was correct before she signed off on it. The contractor was removed through the service exit, which was the route that kept the situation invisible to the summit's attendees and guest staff. Felix Drum, Philip Ash, and Grant were removed through 3 separate routes within the following 12 minutes, each removal quiet, each removal complete. Then she went to the coordination room, sat down at the table, and began writing the operational report. She wrote for 4 hours. The report was thorough because thoroughness was the standard she held regardless of how tired she was, and because in this kind of work, the written record was not an administrative formality, but the foundation of everything that followed the field operation. The prosecutions, the network analysis, the intelligence value that prevented the next iteration of what she had just shut down from getting as far as this one had. She found 3 places in the report where the language was less precise than it needed to be and corrected them. She reviewed the timeline of the operation from her placement date forward and confirmed that the record accurately accounted for every significant event and every decision she had made. She finished the report at 2:17 in the morning. She put it on the coordination desk for Leon, who would review it and transmit it to Owen Hale before the day began. She slept for 5 hours. When she woke, the summit's third and final day was beginning, and in the kitchen below her, the breakfast service was running normally, under the management of the kitchen staff, who had simply absorbed the absence of their section supervisor into the morning's operations, with the practical adaptability that working kitchens have always maintained. The Alpha King signed 3 territorial agreements that day. The summit closed in the late afternoon with the formal departure of each delegation, the courtyard filling and emptying across several hours, as the vehicles were called, and the farewells were made, and the work of the 3 days was carried away in the briefcases, and the memories of 62 people, who would take it back to 6 territories, and build from it the way such events were always meant to build. Mara watched the courtyard from the second-floor window during the departures, not because she needed to, but because it was one of the few still moments the work offered, and she had learned to take still moments when they came. She watched the delegation vehicles pull away through the iron gates, one after another, until the courtyard was empty and quiet, and the estate began the process of returning to its ordinary size. The threat was gone. The summit had done what it was supposed to do. She had done what she had been sent to do. She went back to the coordination room and finished the documentation. There was still a great deal of it left. The days after the summit's close had a quality of settled quiet that was different from the compressed quiet of the days before it. The estate returned to its ordinary rhythms in the deliberate, methodical way that large households return to normal after large events. Systematically, from the outside in, the additional staff leaving first, then the guest wing returning to its standard configuration, then the formal dining room and the reception areas restoring themselves to their default states, and finally the daily schedule of the permanent household recalibrating around the reduced population. Mara remained at the estate for 8 days after the summit closed. The mission handoff documentation was extensive, and she was thorough, and thoroughness in post-operational documentation required time regardless of how well the operation had gone. There were formal debriefs with Leon and with Gareth, and one secure line session with Owen Hale, during which he said, in the specific compressed way he said things he meant with some depth, that the work had been done correctly. She received this without particular response. She did not need the recognition to validate an assessment she had already made. She simply confirmed it and moved on. The formal hearing regarding Dorian Voss was convened on the 3rd day after the summit, in the estate's internal council room, with Caius, Gareth, Leon, and a representative from the PAC's senior command structure present. Dorian was there because the PAC's governance protocols required his presence at formal disciplinary proceedings involving his conduct, and because the proceedings could not have the weight they needed without the accountability being direct. The hearing reviewed the 2 incidents in specific and documented detail. It reviewed the East Corridor event, the date, the time, the witnesses present, the specific nature of the action Dorian had taken with the tray, the language he had used, the request that she pick up the items from the floor. It reviewed the formal dinner event, the date, the guest roster present, the specific language used, the requirement that she stand in the center of the room and address the table. It reviewed the 4 formal staff reports that had been filed following the first incident and received by the Alpha King. It reviewed the Alpha King's response to those reports. Caius had prepared a written account of his own conduct that he gave to the hearing at the beginning of its proceedings, before anything else was presented, which was a decision he had made in the days before the hearing, and which had surprised Gareth, and had not surprised Leon, who had heard enough accounts of Caius in the intervening days to find it consistent. The account described, plainly and without any language that reached toward justification, the fact that he had been informed of the first incident through 3 separate staff reports, and had not acted on them with the directness they required, and that he had been present at the formal dinner, and had been in a position to intervene, and had not. It was 2 paragraphs. It was entirely honest. Dorian sat through the hearing with the controlled exterior of a man who had decided that careful cooperation was his best available strategy in a situation where all other strategies had been removed from him. He answered questions, with answers that were, while not entirely comfortable, honest, in the specific way that honesty becomes accessible when all of the less costly alternatives are no longer available. He said that he had not considered the impact of his conduct. When asked what he had been considering, he was quiet for a moment and then said that he had been considering his position, meaning his authority and his standing in the building, and whether those things were being properly maintained. The hearing room was quiet for a moment after he said this. It was, as Gareth observed later to Leon in the brief exchange they had after the hearing was closed, perhaps more honest than the proceeding had needed him to be. But honesty delivered under compulsion was still honesty, and honesty was the thing the proceeding had required. The formal outcome was twofold: removal of the command assignments that involved direct supervisory authority over non-military estate staff, and a written formal apology to Mara then, on record, to be delivered within 48 hours. He was not required to say the apology aloud or to deliver it in person, which was a provision that had been discussed briefly and had been included without extended debate, because the Alpha King had said simply that the requirement was the record and not the performance, and that the record was what would matter going forward. The written apology arrived on the evening of the second day, delivered in a plain envelope addressed to her by name, brought to the coordination room by the senior footman, who normally managed the formal correspondence routing, and who placed it on the coordination desk without comment. She read it when she was alone. It was 3 paragraphs. It named what had happened, without softening the description. It did not offer reasons where reasons would have functioned as explanations. It said that his conduct had been wrong, and it said it directly. She folded it and gave it to Leon for the operational file, where it belonged. Iris, who had been the first member of the lower floor staff to go upstairs and speak to the Alpha King, was told by Clara Fenn on the 4th day after the summit that her staff review had been updated to note her willingness to report a concern through the appropriate channel. Clara said this without elaborating on what it had contributed to, because Clara rarely elaborated, and Iris understood exactly what it meant, and said thank you with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had done the right thing at the cost of some uncertainty, and had not received anything dramatic in return, which was exactly what doing the right thing usually produced. Nora came to find Mara in the coordination room on the 5th day, not to discuss anything specific, but in the way of someone who wanted to be near a thing they had been watching from a distance, and that had now reached a resolution. She sat in the chair across the desk and was quiet for a while, and Mara continued the documentation she was working on, and the quiet between them was the comfortable kind. Nora said, after a while, "Did you always know it would end like this?" Mara thought about the question genuinely. "No," she said. "I knew it would end somewhere. You don't always know where until you get there." Nora considered this. "You were never just here for the floors," she said. "No," Mara said. "I was never just here for the floors." Nora looked at the desk for a moment. "But you were good at the floors," she said. Mara looked at her. "I try to be good at everything I'm assigned," she said, and meant it. The conversation with the Alpha King happened on the 6th day, after the estate had settled back into something close to its normal rhythm. He sent word through Gareth that he would like to speak with her before her departure, framing it as a request rather than a summons, which was a deliberate choice that she noted. She said she was willing to meet. His study was on the 3rd floor, and she had seen its layout in the floor plans months before, and it was, in person, exactly as the floor plan suggested: functional, ordered, organized around the work of governance rather than the performance of it. Books shelved by subject. Papers stacked with the tidiness of someone whose thinking was clarified by the organization of the physical environment around them. One window looking out over the eastern approach to the valley, where the morning light came in low and angled with the particular quality of late-season morning light. He stood when she entered, which was not something she had expected. She noted it without comment. He thanked her directly and without preamble. Then he told her what he had been thinking about and what he had already said in the formal record of the hearing, that he had received 4 notifications of what had happened in his building and had not responded to any of them with the speed and directness they required. He said this without reaching for any language that softened it. He did not offer reasons. He had already made the assessment that the reasons were real but insufficient, and he was not going to present insufficient things as though they were adequate. He asked what he could do. She considered the question. She considered the 12 people in the east corridor, and the way they had looked in different directions when the silver hit the floor. She considered the 31 people at the formal dinner, and the specific way the Alpha King had looked at the table surface, rather than at the center of the room. She considered Iris, who had gone upstairs anyway, and Nora, who had asked if she was all right with the simple sincerity of someone whose kindness was not complicated by calculation. She considered Clara Fenn's hand on her forearm, and the words that had required Clara to compress something genuinely angry into 4 quiet syllables. She thought about what a building full of 47 people could look like if the person at the top of it made a decision to look at all of them the same way. Look at every person in this building the same way, she said, not by the floor they work on, not by the uniform they wear, not by the title they hold. Look at them as though any of them could be the most important person in the room, and you simply don't know it yet, because sometimes that is exactly what is true. He was quiet for a moment. I understand, he said. She believed him. Not because it was convenient to believe him, or because she was required to believe him, but because she had been trained to read the difference between a person saying they understood and a person understanding, and in his face, in the quality of the stillness that followed what she had said, she read the second thing. She left the study and walked back through the building toward the lower corridor for the last time. The estate was quiet around her in the particular way it was quiet in the middle of a working morning. The specific acoustic texture of a large household engaged in its normal operations, the distant kitchen sounds and the footsteps in the upper corridors, and the voice of Clara Fenn, somewhere giving direction to a staff member with the brisk, confident quality that had not changed at all in the 3 weeks since Mara had arrived. The building was the same, she was the same, the work had been done, and now the work was finished, and the next work was waiting somewhere else. She left on the 8th day after the summit. She left through the service gate, the same gate she had entered through 31 days earlier, carrying the same single bag, with the same plain clothes, and nothing else. The service path was damp with morning, and the valley below the estate was still in the early light, the forest on the northern boundary holding its color against the pale sky, the iron gate swinging closed behind her with the same sound it had made when she arrived. Nora walked with her to the gate. She did not ask where Mara was going, because she had understood without being told that this was not information she was going to be given. She said that she hoped things went well, wherever it was. Mara said thank you. They stood at the gate for a moment, and then Mara walked through, and the gate closed, and she walked down the service road toward the plain vehicle, waiting at the junction. The driver gave her the sealed envelope without comment. She held it in both hands, and looked out the window, as the estate road went behind her, and the junction turned south, and the valley opened out into the flat traveling country of the eastern approach, the kind of country that is neither interesting nor uninteresting, but simply there, between places, the landscape of transit. She did not open the envelope until the estate was fully behind her, and the road had straightened to the long south-running line that would take her to the transfer point. The next assignment was a city she had not been to before, a different environment, different people, a different cover identity, the same essential work, the patient and precise management of situations the world did not know it needed managed, the quiet closing of gaps through which very large and very serious things would otherwise fall. She read through the initial brief and put it in her bag and looked out at the road and thought about nothing in particular for a few minutes, which was a luxury she gave herself between assignments when the space for it existed. The thinking about nothing was not actually nothing. It was the specific restful state that a well-used mind returned to when it was temporarily free of a task, a state that was quieter than work, but more present than sleep, and she had learned to value it. In Cresthaven Estate, 8 miles behind her, the lower floor corridor detail was running on its normal Tuesday schedule. The silver polishing was in the afternoon, as it had always been. Clara Fenn was moving through the building with her clipboard and her efficient authority, and the kitchen was preparing for the midday meal, and the upper floors were occupied with the continuing work of governing a pack whose life had recently been in danger in ways that most of its people would never know about. The east basement passage was clean. The heavy door stood open on a room that had been emptied and catalogued by Leon's team, and returned to the estate's use for whatever the estate decided to do with it. The wooden post at the junction of the service lane and the main road had been examined, and would be monitored going forward. The gap in the perimeter camera coverage at the service entrance had been corrected, and the 12 people who had been in the east corridor on the morning of the silver tray incident, and the 31 people who had been in the formal dining room on the evening of the reception for the Western delegation, and the 3 staff members who had watched through the arched windows of the second-floor corridor on the Saturday morning of the East Courtyard meeting. Those people carried what they had seen with them, in the way that witnessed things are carried, not always consciously, not always in words, but present and real, in the fabric of how they understood the place they worked in and the people they worked among. They talked about her, not loudly and not publicly, but in the specific quiet way of people who have seen something true and want to make sure it does not disappear entirely into the ordinary flow of days. They talked about her in the evenings in the lower staff room, and in the brief exchanges of the corridor when the right 2 people were in the right place at the right time, and when new staff arrived and asked about the estate and its people and its history. The servant who was not a servant. The woman who had knelt on the marble floor and picked up every piece of silverware with hands that had not trembled, not once, in front of 12 people watching, and who had been, in that moment, the most capable and the most dangerous person in the building, and who had said nothing about it, and who had gone right back to work. They told it the way that certain stories earn the right to be told, because it was true, and because the particular shape of its truth was the kind that left a mark on the way you saw things afterward. The mark it left was not dramatic. It was simply this, that you never actually knew who was standing next to you. Not by the floor they worked on, not by the uniform they wore, not by the task they were carrying out when you passed them in the corridor. You simply never knew. Mara was 3 territories east by the time the telling had found its full form. She was somewhere new, wearing a new name, working a new cover, doing the same patient and precise work she had always done. She was watching and listening and building a picture from the inside of a situation that someone needed to understand from the inside, and she was invisible, and she was ready, and the work was continuing. It always continued. The silence in the east basement passage after Leon's voice confirmed all 4 arrests was the specific silence she had heard at the end of previous operations, a silence that was different from the silence of anticipation or the silence of suspension. It was the silence of completion, the particular acoustic quality of a space in which something that has been running for a long time has stopped, and the air has not yet adjusted to the absence of it. She stood in it for a moment and let it be what it was, because she had learned that the transition between the active phase of an operation and the documentation phase required a brief moment of genuine settlement, not a performance of composure, but an actual settling, the specific physical and cognitive transition of a person moving from one state of demand to another. She had learned this from experience rather than from Renvalos, because it was the kind of thing that could not be taught directly, but had to be discovered through the accumulation of finished operations and the gradual recognition of what the moment after them required. She was settled within perhaps 40 seconds. Then she spoke into the communication device, confirmed the custody handoff requirements, and began doing the work that came next. The work that came next was, in some ways, the hardest kind, not because it required physical skill or the management of a threatening situation, but because it required sustained precision at a time when the body wanted to relax into the completion of the operation, and the mind wanted to review what had just happened, rather than continue generating the careful, detailed language of an operational report. She had developed, over 4 assignments, the specific discipline of not allowing either of those pulls to win until the documentation was done, because she had understood from the second assignment onward that the quality of the documentation was directly proportional to the quality of the accountability that followed, and that accountability was what made the whole enterprise worth doing. She wrote the report in 4 hours. It covered 31 days of work inside the estate, from the moment she had walked through the service gate, with her bag held in both hands, to the 43 seconds in the east basement passage that had ended the operation's active phase. It was thorough, accurate, and precise, and when she found the 3 places in it where the language was less precise than the standard she held, she corrected them without frustration, because imprecision in a field report was simply something that existed to be corrected, not something that reflected on the quality of the work that the report described. The report went to Leon at 2:17 in the morning. He would transmit it to Owen Hale before the 3rd summit day began. Caius would receive a summary through Gareth. The PAC's legal and disciplinary structures would receive what was necessary for the prosecution of the 4 people who were now in custody. The authorities' network analysis team would receive the intelligence picture she had built in full, including the dead drop location and the communications equipment in the east basement room, and they would use it to trace the connections she had not been in a position to trace from inside the building. The work of the field was to find and stop the specific thing. The work of the analysis team was to understand the larger context the specific thing was embedded in. She had done her part. They would do theirs. In the formal dining room above her, Caius had signed 3 territorial agreements that evening, working the summit's agenda with the political skill and the accumulated diplomatic capital of 7 years of leadership in a complex territorial structure. The agreements would strengthen the PAC's position in the region. They would create economic relationships that would benefit the PAC's people for years. They were the reason the summit existed, and the reason the threat against the Alpha King had been placed when it was. Because the people who placed it had understood that the summit's success was a thing they needed to prevent. They had not prevented it. She did not think of this with particular satisfaction. She thought of it with the specific recognition of someone who had done the work she was sent to do, and who understood that the work was valuable, precisely because it was not the kind of work that announced itself. The summit had happened. The agreements had been signed. 62 people had spent 3 days in the same building, without knowing that the most important work taking place in that building during those 3 days was happening below the level they could see. That was the shape of the work. It was always that shape. She had always been suited to it. She slept. In the morning the summit closed, and the delegations departed, and the estate began to return to itself, and the work of the days after was the work of accounting for what had happened, and determining what came next, and she was thorough and patient through all of it, the way she was thorough and patient through all of it, because this was simply how she worked, and had always worked, and would continue to work in the next city, and the next building, and the next cover identity, wherever the next assignment placed her. The Alpha King's study would hold the memory of a conversation that had been honest on both sides. The East Corridor would hold the memory of 12 people who had watched, and who would carry what they had watched with them. The formal dining room would hold the memory of a moment at a table that had required 31 people to sit with their discomfort, and that had not resolved itself in the room, but had resolved itself in the days that followed, as things that are not resolved in the room usually do, in the quieter and more durable way of things that have been properly accounted for. Mara was already gone by the time the accounting was complete. She was on a road heading east, in a plain vehicle, with a sealed envelope in her hands and a valley she would not see again receding behind her. The work was continuing. It always continued. She was ready for the next part of it, the way she was always ready, quietly, completely, and without any need for anyone to know it.